We're on.
If you may launch the video, please. Hold on just a minute. We will just wait for participants to come in, and we will start this session with a small video in commemoration of yesterday's observing.
Just 10 seconds more.
Well, just waiting for participants to join in. Okay, maybe then as we continue, as the numbers of participants keep growing, maybe we can use the time to include the video.
Okay,
That is
I will
also
start
available
then.
online, but so for those that are already here.
The funds that I sent back home, I used to pay for my sister's education. I have a sick mom, and my dad is getting old, so that's a lot of responsibility to me as well.
COVID-19 has shown us that Colombians abroad could experience economic difficulties, but they continue sending money to their families in Colombia to help them.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon for those following us in Asia. And welcome to the second day of the Global Forum on Remittances, Investment and Development. For those that were not there yesterday, I'm Pedro de Vasconcelos. I'm the manager of the International Fund for Agriculture Development. The manager of the financing facility for remittances at the International Fund for Agriculture Development. Yesterday, we celebrated the contributions of migrants through remittances to the 800 million family members back home. This morning, we will continue in that spirit and focus on another side of contributions, those that are made particularly to support their home communities, either through investment or entrepreneurships when returning back home. So in that regard, for this session, this third out of 4 session this morning that will be dedicated to Diaspora Impact Investment Entrepreneurship, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator, Frédéric Ponceau. He's a remittances and financial inclusion specialist at IFAD with more than 20 years of experience in various areas of finance and development, including microfinance, SME finance, and payment systems. He will be the moderator for this next session, and he will introduce the panelists for the same session. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Frédéric Ponceau for this first panel, or session 3 today. Frédéric, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pedro. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. It's this third session, as mentioned by Pedro, is about diaspora investment. So we change the perspective. Yesterday, we have celebrated the International Day for Family Remittances, and we have underscored the role of remittances as a lifeline for families and to support their short-term strategy. Today, we will address the diaspora investment strategies that are addressing long-term strategies. So this is a different topic, and this is something we really want to underscore at GFRID, because remittances is addressing a household issue, but it is also mobilizing a series of private and public actors that differ to those of diaspora investments. So without being longer, I will introduce our distinguished discussant. So I'm very happy to have a very diversified and high level in terms of knowledge and skills and position series of discussants. So first, we will have Almaz Negash. So Almaz will be the voice of diaspora investment. She is the founder of the African Diaspora Network, which is based in the Silicon Valley and provide advices to both African diaspora investors based in the US and to African governments, so they can find a good match to foster diaspora investment in Africa. Second, we will have Jean-Michel Severino. Jean-Michel occupied a high-level position at the World Bank. He was also the director of the French Development Agency, and he is now the CEO of Investisseurs et Partenaires, which is a French impact investing vehicle. And he will discuss and he will leverage this long track record working in development finance to discuss how diaspora capital can be bundled with impact investment. Third, we will have Manuel Orozco. I don't know, we have to introduce him. For those who know remittances and diaspora investment, Manuel is a very renowned researcher for, I think, 30 decades. He's been researching, writing paper, and advocating for migrant entrepreneurship, migrant recognition as an actor for local development. So we have the chance to have him on board, and he will present a very recent survey he did last year on investment capacities of migrants that are based from Latin America, that are based in the US. So this is a great pleasure to have you here, Manuel. Then we will have Thomas Ernst, who is working for IOM. So Thomas has more than 15 years working in remittances. IOM is a very well-known organization to work not only on migration issue, but also on remittances, diaspora investment. So they actually tackle all the, let's say, the components of what makes the nexus between migration and development. And Thomas will share with us some insight on how the COVID has impacted migrants in Asia and the Pacific, and how this has affected both remittances and let's say the strategy of migrant returnees back home. Last, but not least, we'll have Stephanie Hausch. We're very delighted to have the German corporation on board. And Stephanie will share with us the strategy of BMZ, which is the bilateral German cooperation. And she will provide us with some insight on 3 projects they are currently supporting to foster migrant entrepreneurship and diaspora investment. So we will start with Almaz Negash presentation. She has kindly prepared a video, so let's listen to Almaz.
My name is Almaz Negash. I am the founder and the executive director of the African Diaspora Network. We are based in California, United States, to be specific, in Silicon Valley, Santa Clara County area. The African Diaspora Network provides a space for diasporans to be a part of the co-creation and co-imagination of possibilities for Africa. We started the organization to bring Africans and non-Africans from around the world to be a part of a conversation, a long-term conversation, not short-term, because the complexity of trying to provide resources and services to 54 to 55 countries in Africa is just as complex as it can be, and yet very fulfilling because the opportunities are there. The question is, how do we address them? If not collectively, one by one, how do we do it? We have the African Diaspora Investment Symposium. We've got 4 programs. The other one is the Builders of Africa's Future, where we bring 10 to 12 grassroots African entrepreneurs to Silicon Valley to learn, to pitch their ideas, and hopefully to give them funding. The third one is Impact and Innovation Forums. These are forums that we host throughout the year, and we're very happy that people are joining us from around the world. We have another new program. It's called Accelerating Black Leadership and Entrepreneurship. ABLE, this one is going to be focused in supporting Black entrepreneurs in the United States. Happy to share other information about the organization, or you can look at our website. As we know, it's estimated that by 2040, Africa will have a large workforce than China or India. This will require, of course, targeted enterprise growth in the areas to enhance food supply chain, healthcare services, educational solutions, and this could only be done, of course, by working with local communities. I think these kind of areas, the need that exists in Africa is actually the area that represents the most opportunity for diaspora business development and exploration. And to do that, though, of course, Africans from the diaspora need the support of African countries, mostly the governments, to enable to provide them an enabling ecosystem where they can actually invest their money in the societies where they feel comfortable to invest in. Remittances, as we know, goes to family, most of the time to family, friends, and at times to community members. That's wonderful, and it's good, and it should continue. The second part of the remittance discussion is investment. Can we, from the diaspora, figure out a way? It's a lot to ask, but a percentage of our saving, can it be invested so that it can be scaled and support communities? That's beyond remittances, but it is doable, and it's happening. It's just happening in fragmented way that I'm not sure what the collective response is. So in that sense, I think it's very important that we figure this out collectively to come up with a way, with a method to enable people to invest. Of course, investment is based on trust, security that you get your funding back, at least your principal back. So I'm not saying that we know all, but there are so many different resources available right now. And in order for the diaspora to feel comfortable and to invest, we always have to continue to build our relationship, build trust, and then eventually that investment. And the trust also goes back, back to governments. Do we trust our governments in the continent enough, in the countries where we want to invest enough to put our money where our mouth is? We do. We take risk. It's probably not as well known, but I think a lot of diasporans went back to rebuild their own home country, and I applaud them. So many of them are doing okay, but a lot of them also come back disappointed. That's just the nature of the go back and forth. Situations are different in 54 to 55 countries, but people are doing the best they can. The other thing I want to talk about is what are we seeing in the diaspora? Well, luckily from the African Diaspora Network, what we're seeing is gutsy, incredibly talented, amazing diasporans putting everything they have betting on their home country to create a technology company, an education business, an online education. They're taking their knowledge back to their home country. I always call that the remittances of the intellectual remittances. We give back. And there is intellectual remittances comes in mentoring and other ways that we provide support to the continent and to our community, but also the investment. So we know from ADN, there is a company in Ethiopia called Gabeya. It's an education marketplace, started from the United States, and it's a venture, it's a partnership between an Ethiopian and another Western Africa entrepreneur. So you see this many different diasporans doing the best they can to invest in countries, whether it's in their home country or in other countries. And I think is an incredible opportunity for Africa, especially for Africa. I say this because there are 30 million, more than 30 million diasporans around the world. And I think we have the opportunity, the capability to give back. The question I always say is, how do we give back? We know how to do the remittances, and that's going to continue. I'm very grateful for that. Now we have to also continue in parallel. We need to continue to talk about how do we scale our remittances. The African Union has plans, others have plans. We look forward to having that conversation. And I personally would like to be a part of that conversation, where then we can mobilize the network that we've developed over the years. We actually are very proud of our African Diaspora Network. We have grown to a point where we are a trusted ecosystem that brings all of us together. And so I would like to find ways for us to work together, to collaborate, and again, to co-create and imagine possibilities jointly together. So I wish you the very best. Thank you, and continue doing what you're doing. And we hope to find ways to be together in person and be able to do this incredibly wonderful work that we all do in our own space to make it possible. On behalf of all of us at the African Diaspora Network and the community we serve, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Almaz. I think that there were some key and very important messages about trust between diaspora investors and the government in their respective home countries, and also let's say the risk profile of diaspora investors that are keen to invest in countries in which let's say mainstream investor would resign. But nonetheless, there's a need, as Almaz mentioned, some support. It's not enough to have this willingness to bring back both knowledge and capital. It's also necessary to have an enabling ecosystem. And thank you very much, Almaz, to have underscored these key principles and key concept. And I will pass the floor to Jean-Michel to share with us his view about diaspora investment and impact investing. C'est à vous, Jean-Michel.
Good morning, everybody. Buongiorno a tutti et bonjour à tous.
So, good morning, everybody. I have prepared a short presentation, which I think is going to be shared by a secretariat. Thank you very much.
But the background is in English. Maybe we can turn to the next slide, please. Donc je voudrais parler avec vous ce matin des...
So I would like to say a few words about how we can mobilize returning capital, repatriated capital coming from migrants and channel that into investment. I'm very glad to see that IFAD has put this topic at the top of the agenda of this webinar. And I would like to thank the Secretariat for organizing this webinar. I'm really happy to be here to share my thoughts on this topic. Now, it's an important topic because the macroeconomic impact of redirecting flows in migrant inflows into investment are significant. Today, the money from the diaspora it can account for a large part of GDP, and in particular for countries in the Sahel region or the poorest countries around the world. And as we know, capital money transfers from migrants, money from migrants is first and foremost used for consumption for housing, social support, and very little of it is invested. But for a while now, a number of players have tried to refocus those funds into investment channels. OECD governments have been quite active in this respect, launching initiatives such as the Diaspora bonds, organizing rechanneling mechanisms such as one-stop shops, housing diaspora bonds, for example. But these mechanisms put in place by national authorities have not been highly successful, probably because the diaspora is culturally wary of public policy instruments. And because the diaspora really wants that money to remain in private hands. But concerning diaspora investment, it's not all about money flows, as we've just heard. Migrants do make a direct contribution to private investment through their own, private personal history. And my own investment company sees that these amounts are quite significant, and we fully focus on financing African entrepreneurs. We've invested in about 150 African startups and small and medium-sized enterprises. So repats, repatriates coming back to the country or account for about 25% of the entrepreneurs that we support. So this is not a marginal phenomenon. And in general, these entrepreneurs make up a large share of our portfolio and the most dynamic and high performance part of that portfolio as well. And talking about capital flows themselves, it's important, I think, to transition towards more innovative vehicles if we want more of that repat capital to be channeled into private investment. If we can have the next slide. Now, from the macro point of view,
Par exemple, si on réussissait à orienter
it is quite a big challenge. If we could channel even only 10% of repat capital into private investment, then the investment rate in Africa would be raised by 1 basis point. And that would make a significant impact. In order to achieve that, well, or society really has an interest in doing that. In European polls that question migrants about their preparedness to invest in Africa, usually they reply with a massive yes. And in Africa, you also see a large number of individual initiatives where you have high net worth migrants that help out startups or set up their own company or help individual entrepreneurs. But until now, it hasn't been possible to transform that overall positive sentiment and these individual projects into a collective project or instrument. When you look at the obstacles, many of them are linked to perception, in particular the perception of risk in Africa, also issues related to the lack of appropriate legal mechanisms, lack of trust, etc. There are also big technical challenges such as tax obstacles, both in Europe and in Africa. Also, in Europe, when you invest in startups, etc., you get a tax investment, tax incentive that's quite significant. And these tax incentives do not exist in Africa. The legal conduits that would facilitate channeling capital into Africa do not exist. These financial flows are not facilitated, and would-be investors really need to jump through so many hoops that they are discouraged. So generally speaking, there really are no investment vehicles available specifically targeted to capturing those financial flows. And so at INP, we have engaged in attempts to set up such novel investment vehicles to establish a bridge between the African diaspora, mostly located in Europe, our target group, and African entrepreneurs by trying to work on bringing down the various obstacles, including social obstacles that bar the way to investment. And so I'd like to quickly present two initiatives to give you an idea of what exists so far. The first initiative was launched by a group of high net worth diaspora individuals in France who got together to form a club called the Efficiency Club. Hundreds of doctors, lawyers, athletes, bankers are members of this club. They set up this initiative. These individuals have been active for decades. They work a lot within and for their diaspora, and they decided to set up an investment vehicle that would receive a mix of institutional investments, funds from Friends of Africa, funds from significant contributions from a number of eminent figures in the diaspora, plus a mechanism that is similar to crowdfunding to collect smaller sums, a few €100 for each contribution. And this would all be pooled into a French company, a Société Anonyme à Capital Variable, which is like a fund of funds investing in African investment funds or by co-investing with other partners in specific entrepreneurial projects. So the benefits of this project is that it's backed by the pre-existing African community. They all have Affectio Societatis. They are already active investors, but they now have an option to invest in already running African projects, but via this conduit, via this channel. And the project was very complex to set up. As for my company, Investisseurs et Partenaires, we were both the technical and institutional partner in this project, and there were very many legal challenges that we had to overcome, and I won't detail them, but they include the authorization by the French market authorities that had never met this kind of hybrid instrument, and they were quite worried about risk, and all the way through to actual availability of market operators. In order to back this project, they had to make significant sacrifices. For example, to invest in companies like this or to interest companies like this, we need to work with intermediary banks that take part in market management activities. And it was very, very difficult to find a bank that was prepared to back a project like that, since there are specific risks and high costs. So the pandemic kicked in and the Efficience Fund had to delay its fundraising initiative, but we are now ready to get back on track. And so I'm glad to say that we have overcome practically all the legal challenges. And in the second half of 2021 or very early days of 2022, we'll be able to get this fund off the ground. And the second project is an IFAD-led initiative. I take this opportunity to thank IFAD. So amongst activities we take part in is backing local investments to finance small-scale local projects. And so we've done that for 7. We set up 7 such vehicles, and we are presently setting up one in Mali. We have Burkina, Niger, and Senegal already covered, amongst others. So setting up a new investment fund in Mali. The objective there was to find a group of investors amongst the Malian diaspora that would be prepared to invest in this investment fund in Mali. And the largest proportion of capital into this fund would be contributed by INP, but also by a large group of national investors comprising banks, national insurance companies, local high net worth individuals, as well as local branches of international banks. IFAD approached us and tasked us with specifically identifying within the European African diaspora, specifically identifying additional investors to top up the investment. So we have identified a high net worth or upper middle class Malian individuals who may have an interest in this project. The advantage is that, of course, they still have ties with their home country, and they would be quite prepared to invest in this fund, but also set up a investment fund under French law that could take up a stake in the Malian investment fund. And if enough money is raised, then that French fund could invest in companies based in Mali alongside the Malian fund. And so this again is a Société Anonyme à Capital Variable. It would then be allowed to raise money and could contribute to the working capital requirements of the local Malian companies. Now, what's interesting here is that we're looking at a group of about 10 or 12 physical individuals. That group can become larger in time, of course, but in contrast with the previous initiative, it focuses only on one country, Mali, whereas the Efficience Africa Fund would cover all of sub-Saharan Africa, could invest in all these countries. So ZIRA, the Malian investment fund that's presently being set up, has an important feature. One important element is that we need to identify a person or an entity that would de-risk the legal structure. If you're a member of the diaspora, putting money into this initiative is a risk. You know, you're putting some of your personal funds in there, and that has a risk. But this whole venture could be de-risked should a public or a not-for-profit entity came in to guarantee or offer up collateral as a way of de-risking the project. Of course, the fund as it is designed will not be highly profitable or cannot be highly profitable right now, since we have to bring in cash, reduce risk, but we also realize that we need to offer a good level of profitability that would be almost on a par with the kind of money you could make by investing in Europe. So we have embarked on this project. We have identified our investors, and in the coming months, we will be finalizing the legal structure of the company. Jean-Michel, I think you're out of time. Yes, well, this is my concluding slide. My last words will be to say, hope to see you soon in Bamako, perhaps by the end of the year, to celebrate with our Malian friends the setting up of this vehicle. And why not in 2022, sometime in 2022, the founding of the Efficience Africa Fund. Merci beaucoup, Jean-Michel.
That will be very useful for the subsequent presentation, but also for the whole session on investment. I think there are challenges along the journey to bring diaspora investors into impact investment vehicles. So I believe this is really clarified thanks to your presentation. So thank you again, Jean-Michel. I will now pass the floor to Manuel to provide us some insight about Latin American migrants in the US and their investment capacity. The floor is yours, Manuel.
Thank you very much, Frederic, and welcome and good morning, everyone. I think the one important issue to keep in mind is that interesting investment and investment practices among the migrants and the diaspora in general, it's one of 4 key forms of transnational economic engagement that people have with their homelands. Typically, if 80% of adults send money, about 5% of migrants actually invest back home. And typically 2/3 or more of that investment actually goes to real estate. And that particularly, it's something that applies among those who are planning to return. So I've been following the intention and the actual practice of investing in the homeland among migrants for the past 20 years to try to understand precisely some of the issues that Jean-Michel was talking about, especially the challenges, the difficulties on how to go about it. And typically you find pretty much the same challenges. The intention to invest exists is typically somewhere around 20%, but in practical terms, only 5% of the immigrant communities end up investing. You may think that this is a small number, but everything is about economies of scale. So think of typically most migrant communities have at least 1 million population. At least 40 countries in the world have 1 million or more migrants living abroad. So we're talking about a critical mass of at least 50,000 people. The average investment capacity, it's relatively small. It's not quite large. It's about $5,000. And it amounts, for 50,000 people to $250 million investing back home. And typically, this investment goes into real estate. In the large majority of cases, without exaggerating, we can safely say that 90% of these investments are done in an informal context. And this is perhaps one of the major challenges, that there are different situations in which people actually are unable to formalize their liquidity they have to invest in some activity because there are no investment vehicles, there are no marketing incentives, there are not enabling mechanism in the homeland to put their money to work. In fact, I even venture to say that the issue of trust is the least relevant of all this. It's the lack of vehicles that and incentives that actually make it very difficult for people to do so. So within that context, I did a survey. I studied late last year to understand remitting behavior among migrants, but also to understand whether their investments capacities had changed or not during the COVID time. And basically, the results of the study show that people haven't changed their investment habits, that they remain interested to invest. 20% of migrants from Latin America living in the United States continue to stress that they are investing back home. The majority of those investments predominantly focus again on in property, on real estate. And now in the practical sense, these are investment practices that apply not only back home, but also in the home, in the host country. And this is typically the majority of the investment opportunities are done in the host country, either by buying a house in the United States or putting money into a small micro enterprise. But the majority is money in the United States, yet a fraction. And that comes out in this particular case, it comes to about 7% of all migrants with an intention or on an investment practice in Latin America. Now, the amount they want to invest is similar to what we have found before, about $6,000, $5,600 on average. That number may seem low. However, it captures pretty much the realities on the ground on what an immigrant wants to buy in. And typically, what most migrants wants to do is to invest in housing predominantly, rather than buying, is to do basically improvement in the household. And typically, what they really need is to put money onto an investment that is worth $30,000. This dovetails with the demand of the housing demand in developing countries that typically moves around $50,000 to $30,000. The challenge is that the financing sector in the developing world and in Latin America in particular typically does not give you mortgage loans below $50,000, much less below $30,000. Most of the investment offer for real estate is above $70,000 to $100,000 because it goes predominantly using a business model that focuses on the condo type of investment that is looking at the upper end of the social echelon. So it doesn't include a significant demand in the housing sector. And public services, the state in general, does not offer lending facilities for that category because that category is pretty high. $30,000, $50,000 is pretty high. What governments typically offer is something under $10,000 for real estate opportunities. So you're found yourself with this gap where migrants end up putting money informally. So this is a very rudimentary process by which you basically go putting money in parts over time, over a period of 10, 12 years to come up with completing the $30,000 investment. Unfortunately, that has a negative effect on the value of your real estate because as you put money on, there is a tear and wear of some of the facilities that you put money in the first time. And so you end up with major problems in the valuation of your home once it's completed in terms of your investment. So these are challenges. in Latin America, there are construction companies, there are banking institutions, savings and credit associations, among others, with an interest to cater to this market. But they find themselves with the lack of identifying the potential buyer in the United States, but also identifying the right investment vehicle and the risk-sharing mechanism. The risk-sharing mechanism is perhaps one of the most difficult ones. One possibility that has come out as an alternative to this approach, it's for finding a partner in the United States that has the ability to provide an equivalent to a real estate loan without using the real estate interest rates. And so there are some credit unions, for example, in the United States with an interest to invest to provide financing at very low interest rates, say 6%, that is much lower than you could get in Latin America. In Latin America, an interest rate on a mortgage house goes to at least 15%. And that's being generous. Typically, it's higher than that. But it provides an incentive whereby the credit union actually will be sharing the risk with the financial institution. And the marketing becomes less complicated, less difficult, because you can use the existing, for example, remittance channels to provide the marketing support to get people, to motivate people to invest back home. These are some of the challenges that we find that still exist. On a general note, in order to mitigate the challenges, one has to be more proactive in the development field to really provide these matchmaking mechanisms between financial institutions in the developing countries and the financial institutions in the industrialized world where migrants reside, before providing the different type of methodologies available. Those investment opportunities exist, but what you need to find is the right vehicles to provide them. So this is the context in which most of Latin American migrants are found. There's been some failed experiments, unfortunately. Some of them were found in Mexico, for example. Other experiments exist on an ad hoc basis, like Guatemala has certain banks that offer mortgages with higher interest rates that are performed, the due diligence is performed from Guatemala using some of the financial records of the migrant residing in the United States. Legal status sometimes is an issue, sometimes it's not. There is a lot of discretionality left on the banking institution. In the majority of cases, the risk is relatively low, but there is a risk is higher than the conventional risk in terms of repayment of the loan. However, the financial institutions do have an interest in being in this market. One of the other challenges is that people make the assumption that all migrants want to invest. And so you start making all these large figures when in fact it's a relatively small pool of people who actually want to invest. It's a relatively small amount of money because it's relative to their income. For example, within the Latin American context, the average income of migrants is about $33,000 a year. So to have $5,000 is basically the 15% of your income if you were comparing income to assets. And that's a relatively decent amount of money. Something that, will not be enough to buy a house in the United States, but would be enough to invest in a house for those who are planning to retire in their home countries. And typically there is a significant number, typically 3% every year of migrants from a given home country decide to retire.
If I may interrupt you and ask you to conclude, or if you have a last message you want to pass, since we are running a bit after time.
No, thank you.
Sorry, Emmanuel, to cut you. I think it's very interesting and very impressive at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock where you are, to have this kind of analysis and fruitful conversation. Take this opportunity and to thank all the, let's say, our Latin America and the audience that is based in the US, to wake up very early and attend to this GFRID. Thank you very much, Manuel. I think that your presentation was very informative. I think we have received plenty of concrete and useful messages. I would mention the segmentation amongst the diaspora between those that are able to save money, those that are able to save money and invest to purchase a house or a plot of land. According to your data, it's 2/3 of the diaspora population that has been surveyed. Then we have those that can or want to launch a business, 25%, 1/4, and let's say the tiny share is those that can invest in financial product back home. So this is a very insightful study. I think we really miss data, and as you mentioned as well, what is missing is options for the diaspora to invest. The money or the savings are there, but there is a lack of trust. There's a lack of reliable vehicle to make the most of these savings and this capital. So thank you very much, Manuel. I will now pass the floor to Thomas from IOM, and he will share with us some trends in Asia and Pacific. Floor is yours, Thomas.
Thank you, and thank you, IFAD, for the invitation here today. Could I just ask the administrator to flip to the 3rd slide, please, on Asia Pacific in the context of COVID? Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. And as you can see, the panelists have come from very different backgrounds, but I think one thing we all certainly share in common is we see a visa as a powerful tool for development. So shifting now to the Asia Pacific region, as of April 2021, we have more than 17 million cases of COVID and over 300,000 deaths as a result of COVID. It's had a devastating impact on migrants in the region, forcing approximately 7 million migrants to return to their countries of origin. Many of the industries in which migrants play a critical role, the tourism, the manufacturing, construction, have been absolutely devastated as well. So just to contextualize that into a bit of a country context, Thailand pre-crisis, roughly 4 million migrant workers in Thailand were contributing between 4 to 6% to Thai GDP. And now as a result of COVID, 700 to 800,000 of those migrant workers have lost their employment. Next slide, please. Recently, the IOM conducted a 12-country assessment on the impact of COVID on remittances across 12 Asia Pacific countries. I wanted to just quickly share an example from Fiji. And essentially, you can see here, again, the incredible growth of digital. So we heard a lot in 2020 about the worries of an enormous fall in remittances, and we all know now that that hasn't necessarily been the case. And we heard 20%, 9%, and I think the drop was something like 1 to 1.5%. So in a number of the countries we studied, 6 of the 12 countries actually increased, including Fiji, as you can see here, and 3 of the other countries had very, very minor drops, such as 0.8% in Philippines, for example, 2020 compared to 2019 levels. So incredible resiliency of migrant remittances. The digital channels is taking on an incredible importance, as we can see here, the rise in proliferation of digital channels. In countries like the South Pacific and Fiji, the digital proliferation of digital channels is critical because so many recipients are having to travel from outer islands to the main island or to the capital, spending all that time. So again, with the digital and the infrastructure that comes with it, we're seeing incredible efficiencies and as a result, more competition and increased choices. Next slide, please. So just a couple of points. So coming back to the resiliency of remittances and migrant remittances during the pandemic, I think what we saw in some of our research across the 12 Asia Pacific countries was a need to really nuance this with deep research into bilateral remittance corridors. So in the case of the Philippines, for example, we saw that the EU and the US channels remained quite strong, and there's a longer history there and a greater stock of migrants, where that wasn't necessarily the case in terms of the resiliency of overseas Filipino workers in the Gulf countries, for example. So when we think about investment and how public policies can help to spur remittances, I think we need to be really careful in terms of the actual corridors where we're applying that to, because some bilateral corridors are obviously struggling more so than others. When we think about diasporas, though, as agents of change, and then you consider the socioeconomic hardships that migrants have faced during COVID, the lockdowns, and the fact that they still managed to send $540 billion in 2020 to low and middle income countries, I think we're again reminded of the ingenuity, the determination, and capacity of migrants, and far from being, victims of circumstance, they're clearly very important actors in global development and drivers of a lot of development globally. I'd like to shift now to a more specific country example. If I could go to the next slide, please. I want to finish by talking more specifically at the country level, in this case, Bangladesh, and focus on tools that IOM has used to leverage the impact of returnees and that impact on local economic development. So I think before governments or development institutions dive into investments, we need to consider and understand a couple of things. What are the needs of returnees, and what are the needs of those communities that they're going back to? I mean, clearly during COVID, a lot of these communities have been overwhelmed with a number of returnees. And how do we work, and Frederic touched on this as well, how do we work to create an enabling environment to foster migration and development? So one of the first tools that we used was a longitudinal study at 2 different points in time in Bangladesh during the pandemic. And over time, we found that there was a decrease in unemployment, but that was particularly as a result of the easing of lockdown measures in Bangladesh. We found increasing reintegration challenges at the community level. And something that I think needs a lot more study as well is the issue of migrant debt, and the increasing debt burden that migrants are facing when they're in countries of destination and even when they're returning back home as well. Next slide, please. So in addition to the rapid assessment that we conducted in the longitudinal study, we also have another tool called the UN Network on Migration. So the UN Network on Migration is a country level tool that serves as a coordinating body to embed migration within UN country teams, and it takes that whole of society approach. And so it helps facilitate tools such as a global compact on migration. And I wanted to illustrate this example here in Bangladesh because you could see how we're using the UN network at the country level, combined with some of the rapid assessment work that we did to translate that into public policy and really getting that whole of stakeholder approach, but taking that public policy and critically turning that into action. And I think part of that action is going to come over on the right part of the slide, where you can see the Parliamentary Caucus on Migration and Development, and getting some of that research and the policy into that Parliamentary Caucus to translate it into action. One of the other actions that's coming out of the UN network on migration, and as a result of some of the research, is we're also developing a national forum for Diaspora, and part of that will look at how we're channeling investments into Bangladesh through the Diaspora, but again, using that UN network. Now, I want to talk a little bit more specifically on the ground, so as a concrete example here from Bangladesh. So IOM has partnered with an organization called the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, and we did so during the pandemic to support 1,600 returnees with specific economic development packages. So these packages combined cash grants and skills-based training, again, linked to the local labor market, tailored to the local labor market. So particularly looking at skills to support entrepreneurship and self-employment in the textile, agricultural, and services industries. So out of those 1,600 returnees, we have 500 of them have now become self-employed entrepreneurs as a result of that very targeted and nuanced training. And just before I finish, I want to end with 2 final thoughts. I think when you're doing this work on the ground, that the importance of cross-referencing the actions on the ground with the longitudinal research, showing that as part of our longitudinal research, there was a perception amongst those returning migrants to Bangladesh that they have much less desire to re-migrate. So clearly, the programs that we're doing on the ground and in the communities take on that much more importance when we can tell that the perception to re-migrate, even over time, is not very desirable. And finally, I think one of my other fellow panelists touched on this idea of intellectual remittances, and IOM has programs called TRQN, the Temporary Return of Qualified Nationals. So to think about the investments in diaspora investment, not as just the financial, but looking at it from an intellectual capital and how we bring those technical skills to Bangladesh to help with the entrepreneurship and the skills training becomes a really important part of local economic development as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We understand that dealing with or supporting migrant returnees involve a multifaceted policy. I will pass the floor to Stephanie. Stephanie, you have the time that was initially allocated to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Faik. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, good afternoon, good morning. It's a pleasure for me to contribute to this panel today from the perspective of the German government and its policy on diaspora engagement. So thank you very much for the organizers for the Global Forum today. For us, from a German government perspective, this is an excellent opportunity to discuss, coordinate, and exchange best practices on remittances and diaspora engagement. So I'm very excited to be able to be here today and through our support contribute also to those joint efforts. I would start by sharing with you the German government policy view in general on migration and development. If you go to the next slide, please. We follow what we call a 360-degree approach to migration, forced displacement, and development in line with the Global Compact for Migration. I'm glad that, for example, just the UN Migration Network was mentioned, which of course for us is also a very relevant reference point for our implementation and support in the field of migration and development. Just to give you a quick overview, we see 4 central elements of this 360-degree approach, ranging from tackling of root causes, then of course our support to refugees, IDPs, and hosting communities, then the whole field of development-oriented regular migration, migration governance, and here we see also the policy of diaspora cooperation remittances. And part of this 360-degree approach in our understanding is also a voluntary return and sustainable reintegration. As many of my previous speakers also highlighted, this approach to migration and development, of course, has to be embedded in a whole of government and whole of society view. In our case in Germany, we are very much committed to also contribute to multilateral efforts in this regards, which complement bilateral partnerships we have. So just zooming in a little bit on diaspora and remittances, what is the approach of the German government? We see, of course, our commitment to the contribution to the GCM objectives 19 and 20 to create conditions for migrants and diasporas to fully contribute to sustainable development through their skills and competences, as well as through, but not limited to, financial remittances and investments. I like the notion of intellectual remittances very much. That's also part of our approach, that we not only focus on remittances in a financial way, but also support transfer of skills, competences, knowledge as a part of an intellectual remittances contribution for development. There, in this part of time, I also would like to underline that our view on contributions of the diaspora, of course, factor in the fact that investments are not possible for all members of diaspora. So it's not that in our point of view, this is the onlyest lens we are using, but of course, focus on investment of diaspora actors. It's an important subsector focusing on our overarching goal to contribute to sustainable development and to engage the private sector in this regard. Members of the diaspora, migrant organizations, be it individuals or organizations, are therefore important partners of our development policy. So we acknowledge and support their significant contributions both in countries of origin and countries of destinations. And we see them as agents of change for both societies and a strong pillar of German civil society in the field of development policy. So to this end, for example, we will also institutionalize an exchange with diaspora and migrant organizations in Germany, which are interested in development policy, and conduct a strategic high-level dialogue with interested organizations to really make sure that we fully integrate their knowledge, their expertise, and also their implementation power into our development policy in the field of migration and development. When it comes to remittances and diaspora investments, we seek to facilitate an environment where cheap, fast, and safe remittances are available to migrant families and where recipients can invest these funds sustainably. So we believe that we have to improve the general environment for sustainable private investments, and I was really thrilled to see some very innovative ideas presented here by my fellow panelists, and to make sure that we can make use of the investment power of the diaspora to the fullest. So can we go to the next slide, please? On the next slide, I wanted to share with you 3 examples which are part of the German approach towards remittances and diaspora. So the first one is a project which is called WeDo, and it's offering financial support for small businesses in Africa. The overall objective is to maximize the impact of remittances, and it's not only focusing on financial support, but it's also offering a platform where investments are planned. Then there's the grant element, and there's a strong focus on coaching for entrepreneurs to help them plan and operate their business for the best possible results. And so far, there have been 1,650 projects approved. Around 5,000 jobs have been protected or planned, and 4.6 million euro have been mobilized by combining private investment and of the ODA funding from the German Development Ministry, BMZ. A second project we implement is the so-called Business Ideas for Development approach. And the objective is to encourage diaspora to invest in countries of origin by starting a business, and with a specific focus on innovation, private sector development, and sustainable development. And one example in the framework of this approach, the Business Ideas for Development approach, is the Meet Africa project, which is implemented together with the French colleagues from AfD. Part of this program is also a strong focus on coaching, individual business coaching. We offer funding for market exploration and for services to support startups. And we also support networking activities and peer-to-peer learning in this framework. So since 2009, 800 entrepreneurs have been supported. We have a range of successful business registrations, currently focusing on 10 partner countries. And the last approach and project I wanted to share with you is a RemTech accelerator, focusing on technology and remittances, especially on more South-driven innovation and remittances technologies to make sending remittances cheaper, easier, and to promote SDG-related investments. For me, this is really a very exciting new approach, also making use of blockchain technologies and encouraging new ideas in this field, which at least for Germany as a donor in the field of migration and development is relatively new. And we are looking forward very much to the results of the first round of support for 10 startup teams. We will be, the pilots will start soon, and I'm really looking forward towards the results of this approach. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present the German policy approach on remittances in diaspora, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It is very insightful to have some example of project, I think, that give a clear idea of what options to diaspora investment can be offered. We are running a little bit behind. We are a bit behind schedule, so I just want to mention that we will respond to the question by written. So please address your question to the speaker you want to interact with, and we'll manage to revert to you with the responses. So the address, the email address you have to address your question is gfrid@ifad.org, and that will be our pleasure to respond to you. So thank you to all the discussants. Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. And I will pass the floor to Pedro for the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frédéric, and panelists, for this very insightful. Unfortunately, yes, we're running out of time, but this is something natural now within these Zooms. We try to keep it short and sweet, but there's so much to say about this. So as Frédéric said, we're going to be answering the questions. If you still have questions to ask, do not hesitate to still send it. We're compiling, we are finalizing the ones asked yesterday. We will do the same for today, so please do not hesitate. This is an ongoing process, and this is just the first panel in this regard, so it is an ongoing discussion. So for now, this said, for the next panel, I would like to, we will address the topic that is very close to my heart, as it matches almost in all degrees the DNA of IFAD, and these are the contributions, commitments, and in particular the actions that migrants and their families have and do in regards to climate change. It's a very challenging topic that is linked to the realities of millions of migrants and their families, not only because of climate change is a major source of migration, as we know today, but because through the use of remittances and certain investments, migrants and their families, as well as diaspora, actually use these remittances or investments to adapt to the challenges posed by climate change. And this might be through irrigation systems to combat drought, building community wells, or change the nature of their small businesses in a resilient move, particularly as we've seen lately. So for this panel, that we will be provided with the time allocated, so we will finish a little bit later, 15 minutes to be honest. I would like to invite Mr. Steve Wilson. He has over 30 years of experience in private sector development, extensive background in remittances and private investment and business related to climate change. He's been the lead author of a publication launched many years ago, where the first publication really trying to look on remittances and development, called Beyond Small Change. He's been working for Pfizer, UNIDO, IDB Invest, Levoca Impact Labs, and will be the moderator of this discussion today, and a starting point for this ongoing discussions that we will have between diaspora investment, migration, climate change, and diaspora contribution. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Steve Wilson from IFAD now. That is very early. He's in Washington, D.C. right now. So thank you for being with us so early, Steve. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Good day to everyone. It's an honor to be here and part of this panel. Diaspora investment and climate change mitigation and adaptation, a reality check. There's a lot of climate technology or terminology in that title. We're going to keep it a lot more practical, I think, than that in the discussion today. And we have a tremendous cast of discussants today that I would like to introduce before saying a few prefatory remarks. First, we're happy to have Louise Baker, the Managing Director of the Global Mechanism of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Louise has been with UNCCD for, I believe, at least 10 years and has an extensive body of experience in other important international institutions in the global framework, including the World Health Organization and time at the European Parliament, among other really interesting activities. In addition, we have Dr. Magali Emile Becker, co-founder of the Haiti Renewal Alliance. Dr. Emile Becker is also, for the last 15 years, been a clinical research scientist, working on a variety of areas relative to the development of new types of pharmaceuticals and clinical interventions. She mentioned to me in a phone call, she's also working very closely with Moderna, obviously at the forefront of the COVID vaccines. And then finally, we're very pleased to welcome Martin Fleury, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Red Mangrove Development Advisors. Martin has been out doing great work for the last 15 years in private sector development, social investment, working a lot with SME development in Africa and Caribbean and elsewhere. So we have an incredibly knowledgeable panel. But before starting, just to quickly frame the discussion, since the title gives the impression that we're going to go into a deep dive on climate change, and we are, but I'd like to stress that human beings experience climate-related risks in social and economic terms. It's the impact on livelihoods and settlement and health and food, water, and energy security and property and supply chains are the ways that people experience this threat, not as some hypothetical scientific challenge. And so climate science and policy generate lots of terminology, and the United Nations has been at the forefront, and we have them to thank for our knowledge base at this point. But this terminology does not help us much when we're talking in rural areas to farmers who may not know how to respond to the question, does climate change affect your farm, your operation? But they will be able to tell you in great detail if they're bothered by drought or shifting precipitation or heat waves or invasive pests, etc. We know that we don't have to repeat the fact that climate-related risks like drought and heat waves and crop failures certainly cause a lot of migration. And we know that that migrant remittances are incredibly resilient, even in the last 15 months of this global pandemic. What we know less about is to what degree some of these remittances, this financial sign of the social compact between migrants and their families, are being used to purchase products or services that help families, particularly in agriculture, but not only, become more resilient in the face of climate-related risks. We know even less about diaspora. In fact, Dr. Orozco's intervention in the previous panel was interesting because we don't, this is the first I've heard of diaspora investment over the last 15 months. We know even less about that. And for our panelists who have worked or work extensively with the diaspora, they understand as non-state actors how difficult it is for the development institutions to understand diaspora investors, and simultaneously for the diaspora to work in a creative and a productive way with development institutions. So I throw out to the panel three very general ideas for them to deal or to grapple with individually or in some way, all three. And that is, can migrant remittances help both the senders and receivers of remittances, help families have more choice in terms of the products and services and know-how that they need to better respond to things like drought, heat waves, water scarcity, flooding, and other climate-related risks. And likewise, diaspora investment as non-state actors? What role could diaspora play, maybe in cooperation with more conventional development actors in helping rural families deal and cope better with climate risks? Are there actual investment opportunities that are being generated by this threat? Thirdly, we know that migrants and we know that diaspora investors are many of them are entrepreneurs. Does the threat of climate change, and in terms of risks like drought, heat waves, et cetera, also represent possible entrepreneurial opportunities for very small to SME sized firms in these areas? Again, these are general questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our panel. And what we will do is go to Louise, Maglier, and Martin in order, and then if there's time at the back of this for a wrap up, we will do that. So without further ado, Louise, could you please begin? Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have the worst title in the whole world, probably, in terms of my job. I'm the managing director of the global mechanism of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and Drought in Countries Experiencing. It's very complicated and very long. It looks actually in a very practical issue, though. It looks at, exactly as you said, how people experience climate risk. What we know is how you manage the land, whether you sustainably manage the land or whether you degrade it, has a direct impact on your resilience to climate change. So healthy and productive land builds your resilience, degraded land undermines the resilience of the ecosystem and the populations. So when you talked about your rural, the person living in a rural area seeing droughts and invasive species, they're seeing UNCCD in action, and hopefully we can be part of the solution together to counter that and to build the resilience of communities together. Climate related risks. We are seeing an increasing amount of land degradation. Despite all efforts, the rates of land degradation are increasing. It's obviously mostly a rural issue, but it is the falling productivity is a driver of outmigration from rural areas to the cities. About 40% of remittances are received into rural areas, and of that money, about 25%, from what we understand, is going into sort of productive activities. A lot of that going into the agricultural sector, actually almost 4 times more than official ODA into the agricultural sector. So there is certainly the opportunity, I think, here to see an investment that is both productive, that builds resilience for communities and builds resilience for the ecosystem. Globally, adaptation finance receives the crumbs from the table. Most of the money into climate finance is going into mitigation activities, into energy and infrastructure. Very little going into adaptation. Remittances they're therefore being particularly useful because they directly reach households, so that builds individual resilience. They have a kind of shock absorbing function, I think, in that you see, yeah, it's almost like a form of private insurance for a climate catastrophe. And I think that has a really useful kind of useful function in itself. And as the previous panel said, very, very reliable despite the crises. I've sounded I'm potentially maybe a bit depressing there, but I think that there are massive opportunities as we move into a decade, I suppose, of action, of regeneration of ecosystems that offer opportunities for diaspora investments. There are approximately 1 billion hectares of degraded land out there. Actually, there's 1 billion hectares pledged by governments around the world in terms of land that they plan to restore. And if you think about it, degraded land is an underperforming asset for the private sector. If you can close that productivity gap, you can make a profit. So we would hope to see a kind of closing productivity gap on up to 1 billion hectares of land over the course of the next 10 years. I hope, it does require, as many of the speakers I'm sure will have said as well, it does require kind of incentives to do that, but it needs creative incentives as well. And I think in the land sector, there are different opportunities for incentives that you can look at. And I think we would look at things like land tenure and governance incentives as potential areas that could really stimulate a kind of a flow of investment into regenerative agricultural techniques that restore ecosystems, that restore agricultural productivity and build resilience against climate change. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. Very good. Then we'll go ahead and proceed to Dr. Emil Bakker. If you'd like to kick off.
Yes, good morning, very early morning. Thank you so much. And I wanted to thank Manuel for presenting the Latin American Caribbean region, as well as Jean-Michel and Thomas. I think they built the case elegantly for the diaspora in terms of investment. So that was pretty awesome. Thank you so much for that. As Steven said, my name is Magali Milbiker, and I'm representing Haiti Renewal Alliance, which is an organization that my husband and I founded after the earthquake. And really, we founded the organization to promote business development and investment in this space. And when I say this space, it's really sort of formalizing this movement called diaspora engagement. We tried taking it to the next level to engage and integrate diasporas. How do we engage and integrate diasporas to foster more direct investment? And one of the things that, again, was presented early on very elegantly was the lack of platforms to foster trust, and also even more basic, to foster endorsement and advocacy on behalf of the diaspora. So I think that I commend all of the presenters for all of the activities, the research that has gone into promoting such an important activity. And also too, the fact that it's finally being really recognized. I think that's a great start. In the context of climate change, I mean, I think, we all know that climate change has significant socioeconomic impacts, particularly on the poor, on agriculture, and it also causes increased food insecurity. And this is one of the areas where I think diasporas, I think there were some projects mentioned earlier, but diasporas can fill some of the gaps within the humanitarian sector. But I think it's important to note that we know that we operate in parallel to the international development landscape, but more importantly, we tend to not really fit any particular mold, right? We do our own thing. Diasporas kind of operate in that nexus. We don't consider it assistance or development. We pretty much do both. And so identifying platforms and vehicles that really allow us to bridge our resources, both human and financial, as mentioned earlier, to be able to meet some of those needs, I think is definitely one criteria. So I'd like if you could put up the first slide. I want to just go on to this. So one thing, given the limited resources in the space in general, why aren't we leveraging diaspora more? This is something that I think the research clearly states that we are 4 to 5 times more official development assistance. So why are we not leveraging these resources? And so, thank you. Yes. Great. And so I think it's important to note that beyond remittances, unlike traditional actors, the diaspora operates at this nexus between humanitarian assistance and investment. And so we have to start looking at ways to move beyond this traditional model that is tends to circumvent and also often compete against existing local based programs, instead of using the opportunity to enhance programs in partnership with diasporas. If we want to look beyond humanitarian assistance and we want to move into the development space, we do have to start making those connections, bridging both spaces. And I'm originally from Haiti, and I can tell you climate change impacts the Caribbean very much. Between the earthquake to Matthew and to the Bahamas, to Dorian that hit the Bahamas in 2019, I mean, our region is still recovering very heavily from disasters. And so the assistance has to transition beyond the immediate and into recovery and investment redevelopment. So this slide basically is looking at some of the old, well, current, I should say, models of aid. And although aid has an important role, it is recognized that no substantial amount of aid has ever really brought a nation out of poverty. I mean, if that were the case, Haiti received so many billions, we'd be an extremely rich country by now. We also recognize that aid has some limitations in lacking some sustainable features. So unless these programs start to mirror platforms that prioritize some of the sustainable development goals, and again, address some of the assistance beyond just aid, but really building infrastructure in the country, it will be very difficult for countries to really get out of this vulnerable state and be more prone to continuing to be fragile during disasters. And then if you go to, so one of the things I like to say is, you know, I think that donors are finally starting to recognize that they need more models, partnership models, and some are even taking a chance with funding certain pilots and programs to engage diasporas and accelerators and things like that. So I commend the donors for really taking an opportunity to create such platforms. And we ask that the non-traditional actors that were called, that we really take an opportunity to form partnerships with diasporas. International organizations need to start looking at diaspora and private sector and not really seeing us as competitors. Because again, you know, in terms of remittances are alone, they're quite passive, right? I send money back home to my auntie or etc. The image, but just imagine structuring the remittance models at this nexus where you have the assistance or aid, but then it transforms into more development, more sustainable opportunities. And I think that as long as we have, and I think this was mentioned in the previous session, as long as we have trusted financial vehicles, we will bring in the resources, because guess what? I know 5 guys right now that basically broke their 401ks to invest, to build. And so I think it's very important that we not circumvent the diaspora in both the humanitarian as well as the development space. And so the next slide. So HRA has been looking at some other solutions. We have a couple of platforms. And these platforms are really community-based models that are aligned with the you know, specifically I'll speak for Haiti, the country's national priorities, as well as the SDGs. We think that diaspora accelerators are an excellent opportunity to demonstrate innovative ways to have targeted, more impactful investing. And I know that there have been some challenges. We tried working with the World Bank. There are, for the Caribbean, it's difficult apparently the bonds and some of the platforms for India may not typically work for the Caribbean region. So we just need a lot more research in the space for our region to see what will work. And so these traditional cluster models, the cluster framework is one that we use for another model that we are working currently out. So Tomas is with the IOM. We actually have a partnership with the IOM on this new model. And this model is for us to create a diaspora framework where we can enhance coordination. Well, HRA wants to take it to the next level to use those coordination mechanisms for not just in the humanitarian assistance space, but also to identify ways that we could actually improve funding platforms as well. And so I know we don't have a lot of time, so I will just simply say that some key core elements of what we've been doing for the last 10 years with our Haitian Diaspora platform is, in addition to hosting what we have as, everyone probably knows Sharks Tank, well, we have a model called Investors Tank. And I'm happy to say that, we've seen some great success on that platform. In fact, one of our recipients 6 years ago actually was on the real Sharks Tank this year. So that was really awesome to be able to see that, because it's very important that we identify ways to allow the diaspora to feel that they can have a trusted platform to put their resources, not just, again, financial, but also intellectual. And so the 5 key components around our platform is, again, community-based, where we have an interface with the local ministry called DPC, where we work with them for preparedness platforms. We've done a lot of stuff with trainings, capacity building trainings with the IOM. So the notion of diasporas not having the expertise in the space is not true, but also too, we can create programs where we enhance the skills of diasporas to be able to work in this space. We have something that we work very closely with our embassy. During the earthquake, we basically created the Diaspora Command Center. So one of the things as part of the framework is having a hub where we can get together and basically create an opportunity to coordinate. So we coordinated at within the US, but we were also pulling resources and speaking to our Haitian brothers and sisters in Canada and in Europe to be able to say, how are we going to respond to this particular disaster in Haiti? And so the command center really served as a focal point for us. Obviously now it's virtual. We continue to grow our partnerships through umbrella organizations. And then we instituted this somewhat protocol to have annual preparedness activities to train the diasporas for best practices. Don't send coats to Haiti, right? I mean, Haiti is a hot country, and just creating, sending cash versus a bunch of materials. And then finally, we spent quite a bit of time trying to track this. We know that there's a financial tracking system for the international community, but no one's really tracking, outside of remittances, they're really tracking how much we're spending in disasters. And so it is a major undertaking, getting people to sort of divulge what they've spent and their personal organizational information. But we did launch this in support of the UN at the time, and it was something that we are continuing to do because we do believe that it's important. And then finally, the figure on the right is the framework that HRA and IOM, the diaspora framework that HRA and IOM is currently developing. Stay tuned, but we do believe that more models for better internal coordination during disasters or humanitarian assistance in general can also be leveraged to help coordination and build trust within the community to structure investments. I will stop there, and we look forward to continuing to work with new partners in leveraging this framework and other models to engage diasporas in a more structured fashion. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now we can turn to Martin Fleury.
Thank you, Steve. They are very interesting ideas and comments, and so I'm very grateful to be here on this great panel. I have been gardening a lot lately, but as you all heard, I'm more knowledgeable on investment and economics, so sorry if I tend to focus on this side of the topic. I just want to share some thoughts, perhaps in a scholarly way, about remittances, investment, and entrepreneurship with linkages to various projects with regards to climate mitigation and adaptation. Regarding remittances, it appears to me that diaspora would be more likely to support and send money if they know that the use of these remittances are more linked to the purchases of inputs for agricultural resilience. That could generate more wealth for the populations instead of supporting daily life expenses. Therefore, it creates also a dynamic for less need of remittances later, or a shift towards more productive uses of the remittances and then investments. So I would say that with regard to remittances, they are part of the solutions, but they also require greater awareness and accessibility of the solutions that can create more climate resilience. But well, we saw that thanks to these opportunities, we can also perhaps engage diaspora more on investments instead of remittances. And with regard to diaspora investment, I just want to share 3 observations in connection with the climate change. First, we all know that there are very important climate-dedicated funds. We just heard that they are more directed to energy, for instance. Even though they will be more accessible to rural projects, they are very barely known by small project holders. I think we've all heard of COP21 or other events, but I think there isn't a wide knowledge about the existence and ways to access these funds. Even though they were more known, I find them extremely complicated to reach in terms of vocabulary, timing, documents to be provided. It's quite far from the ground. And because of all that, I don't have the figures, but I presume that these funds do not reach enough underserved rural areas and their populations. So, second observation, diaspora could connect these funds to rural projects because they can build projects with their community. They can be reached out more easily for awareness of these funds, and they could also tap expertise more easily to respond to the calls. So I think there is the missing link could be diaspora. There could be another operator that can help leverage more funds to rural communities. It's the investment vehicles that can foster this kind of virtuous circle. We heard about Investisseurs et Partenaires thanks to Mr. Severino. I just also want to mention FADEV, which is a French savings cooperative, which has a collective governance, which was as an equity crowdfunding platform. They can savings in France with equity in very specific areas, and all the legal paperwork has been processed and is already working. So there are ways to also foster this kind of investments. So I would say that there is a place and a need to connect these 3 types of actors, and I think donors and particularly IFAD is well positioned to bring all of them together. And last point regarding entrepreneurship, I don't think that diaspora entrepreneurs are always the more savvy on these issues. They do have a broader view, but they could be competition. They could be considered as competition with the local private sector. So I would say, and I strongly believe that there is an opportunity for diaspora entrepreneurs to complements local value chains through the provision of intrants, inputs, the rental of equipment, because the production itself will be filled by local private sector. It's usually the case, and those complementary investments are perhaps more risky, less obvious to be identified, and they can leverage on local production and bring also the good technology and knowledge and techniques that that can help improve the resilience of agriculture, for instance. That were just a few thoughts. I know that you want to have discussions, so I just leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Very interesting. I would just like to, in the interest of, I think we actually have been very, very disciplined in our timing here. I wanted to follow up. There's a lot of questions that are coming in offline, and I believe if I understand it correctly, they'll be forwarded to each of the speakers that you can respond to individually. First of all, I'll go back in the order in which everyone spoke. Louise, I neglected to mention that today is the UN Day of Desertification, which had a lot to do with the timing of this panel, pardon the omission. Extremely important day and acknowledgement of a huge global issue. I was intrigued by your reference to something that I'm involved with right now with a startup company in Brazil on regenerative agriculture and the importance of soil. And, you know, without going into a sidebar discussion on all of the things that go into that approach to agriculture, and I'm very interested to see that large transnational food and beverage corporations seem to be embracing this with great gusto. Whether it's greenwashing or not, we don't know, but we do know that this is an enormously promising set of techniques and practices. And I'm just wondering, is this a possible area where the Venn diagrams between the shaded area between the crisis that is desertification / climate change and the opportunity, which is a response such as regenerative agriculture, particularly in light of the fact that all of the you know, in the next 50 years, most of our terrestrial based additional food production will come from EFAD client countries in the tropics. Just curious as to whether UNCCD has thought about this, or how you might be grappling with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the vast majority of the world's food comes from areas that you would call the developing world, and they're feeding vast numbers of people on actually relatively small plots. They're incredibly efficient actually on the land that they use. I think going forward, I would hope that we would across the board adopt regenerative techniques, very, very simple, often kind of low cost kind of interventions. What I think is changing is we're moving away from the big industrial agriculture to kind of scientifically valid, small scale, environmentally replenishing kind of, so we're seeing this become, we hope, the new normal in 30, 40 years. One of the things that needs to change with it is the discussion around value chains. And I think there's an interesting Venn diagram there that I read something the other day, which I thought was hilarious. Not hilarious, tragic. Lagos is one of the world's biggest importers of tomatoes. What is that? Really? Okay. So but I think looking at value chains, shorter value chains, local value chains, building in a kind of a challenge, a sourcing challenge actually, to diversify cropping, to ensure we have biodiverse cropping, building in crops from dryland areas into global value chains so that we kind of create a market for crops that grow well in those areas. We're seeing this in places like Africa's Great Green Wall, places like that, where there's this great reimagining about what's possible in the Sahel, great reimagining about what private sector value chains could look like in that area. And I think that really represents a huge opportunity for diaspora investments and remittances to invest in local value chains, in regenerative value chains, and in connecting that kind of rebirth of dry land areas with the kind of the rest of the world. We have a fascinating project called the 3S Initiative, which is again in that kind of area largely, that's really trying to provide opportunities for migrants or potential migrants to stabilize their environment in their home communities, linking them with external investment and really sort of building up those communities to be able to be part of this economic structure that we hope is coming. So I think there's a long way to go, but there's definitely a movement and a momentum there around sort of small projects linking up, being part of a kind of completely reimagined value chains in this part of the world. Barbara, I think, has put in the chat information about this 3S initiative, which is a really interesting interconnection between rural jobs, value chains for youth, and migration. So yeah, there's a lot to do. Desertification Day is an interesting day to mark the fact that this relationship is both positive and negative. You know, land degradation and climate change driving each other, but also the possibilities that the land sector and getting the land sector right have to mitigate both food insecurity, poverty, and climate change. So
Thanks very much. That's great. Maglier, I just wanted to follow up with you as well. You made a very insightful statement where you talked about, I'm rephrasing, but you were really talking about the connection with diaspora, and particularly in places like Haiti, where there's the potential, it's not the potential, it's the mix of humanitarian response and investment. And when we're talking about climate change as it faces humanity, it is first and foremost a humanitarian crisis. And we all know that it's the most vulnerable with the least resources, and sometimes by accident of geography, and incidentally, the ones that are the least responsible for the problem in the first place, who are exposed to this. And I'm just wondering, how would you see, you alluded to this quite a bit. You had a really, but if you had to rank order in importance, how governments, financial institutions, and other organizations such as IFAD could develop an incentive system that would encourage diaspora investments. Mm-hmm. What do you think would be the low-hanging fruit? I know it's a tough question.
Actually, Louise, what Louise just mentioned is great, and I'm going to definitely follow up with her. I think we could repurpose remittances and structure them in a way that would support the continuity of aid beyond aid, right? So aid through recovery, transitioning it into greater investments, direct investments. If you take the example that Louise just mentioned, I mean, let's think of like a project in the jardin or garden project, where we support the training of farmers, paying for some of the tools to scale up their land, their agriculture, and its system in this supply chain, and create, first of all, provide them opportunities to be able to feed themselves, because sadly, I've been told, and I thought it was a lie, but at some point we were starting to import things that I couldn't believe, like coconut and some areas mango, and I'm like, no, that can't be true. That has to be a lie, right? And so if the land isn't being nurtured, that is a huge problem. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity for diaspora professionals who are in the agriculture space, who are experts in certain industries, to be able to support the government and build a capacity, developing some of these research and policy strategies. And so investment at the intellectual level, but then diasporas like myself, who I do have I have an income that I am very open to investing. My husband and I are both investors, and we invest both in the US as well as in Haiti. Why are we not maximizing that to the fullest potential? There are a lot of diasporas who want to invest, but the confidence isn't there. And I'll just speak specifically for Haiti. So the reason why we focus on the platform is because the platform and the endorsement of the platform, it has to be backed. We've talked about, I think someone earlier talked about government diaspora-backed mortgages. We actually have a really amazing concept that we want to employ, but we also have to make sure that there's political stability in the country. So, you know, I think part of the challenge for us, the biggest thing would be the context. If we go the private sector route, are our funds going to be secure? I mean, it just, you know, as an investor, obviously you're risk takers, but we also want to make sure that we have some level of insurance. That's the first thing. And then secondly, partnerships. There's such a missed opportunity in the humanitarian sector as well as the development space to not leverage the diaspora for fear, diaspora as well as private sector, by the way, for fear of competition. And I think that when it comes to saving lives, all of the problems in Haiti specifically and in developing or least developed nations, as an entrepreneur and as an investor, I see it as an opportunity. An opportunity to not only impact lives, but an opportunity to really grow financially, not just for the country, but also as an investor. There are investors in Haiti that are doing very, very well. So how do we structure it where we can build that trust? I hope I answered your question.
It's a tough question. No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it was tough.
Thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Maratan, there is a question that managed to get through to me for you. And that is specifically regarding diaspora crowd investing and the regulatory system in France. Does the current regulatory or regulations in France support or does it facilitate these kinds of operations in among beneficiaries in Africa, for example, where these models focus on profit or even sustainability? So somebody had a question regarding the French regulatory environment and what role, if any, it has on that type of crowdfunding and more impact investment type operations.
Sure. First, so sorry, believe it or not, as I started speaking, the rain started to change. Well, the climate started to change and it rained heavily. So
okay. I can repeat the question.
I heard it. It's just apparently you had trouble hearing me before, so I hope it's better now. In terms of regulations, of course, through the anti-money laundering and fight against terrorism, there are a numbers of processes and agreements to be had for being able to operate. There are a few operators that started operating. The one I mentioned is in this case before the law began to be very hard to cope with. Now, I would say it's you can have correspondent banking. If you're in Europe and if you go through the whole process and you can pay lawyers and you can have your questions answered, you can be certificated in a few years. I think the difficulty is when you're operating from the south, if you want to, if you're a remittance operator, if you're a platform in Africa wanting to receive funds from Europe, it could be both costly in terms of sending the money and sometimes it falls under some laws that you cannot really necessarily understand and defend your case in Europe once you're not in the country. So I would say there is a potential important market, but as it stands now, there are few operators, and we should really help them, whether it's fintechs or cooperatives or associations. There are really bridges to be made, whether with existing solutions or new solutions that can also leverage on the difficulties right now. But dialogue with the regulators is necessary. I know there are sandboxes looking at solutions and trying to improve the process of accreditations, but it takes time, and I think we need more innovation and projects on those topics to ease the difficulties of sending money and gathering savings for equity investment in Africa in particular. Your microphone is off, Steve.
You're on mute.
Okay, that was a fun little, as a pre-digital native, moderating things in the COVIDium is a real challenge. But in any case, we're a smaller panel than our predecessor, so I think we're probably closing in on wrapping up. I would just say that I think it's been a fascinating discussion from a variety of perspectives on how different actors, how the diaspora, the diaspora are almost by definition entrepreneurial, who have tremendous market intelligence, creative, innovative groups. How can they better be involved with a practical response to one of the great challenges facing humanity, which is first and foremost a humanitarian challenge? And to the point that Louise made about the asymmetry in aid going into mitigation efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions versus helping people to creatively adapt and become more resilient. This reflects capital markets and also the marketability of wind turbines and solar panels and big infrastructure versus smallholder farmers and people who are suffering disproportionately because of this. But given the need for additional food production in the global family, they're going to have to be a big part of the solution. Louise, did you want to add something?
I did. Because I will be in trouble if I don't come in and say something after that. You're absolutely right. It is a market imbalance, but actually getting carbon back in the soil, in the land and the soil, right, sustainably managed, is also up to 30% of the solution to the climate mitigation challenge as well. So we're fixing that too.
Good. Thank you.
Great investment on every front.
Good.
Thank you.
So anyway, with that, I wrap it up and thank the panelists very much and turn it back to Pedro.
Thank you, Stephen. This was a fantastic panel. I mean, both, particularly on this day, these are desertification day. I think I would love to say that it's planned, that it was planned. It was by coincidence in the sense that June 16, International Day of Family Remittances and other contributions, and of course June 17. Desertification Day, and how diasporas, migrants, 200 million migrants sending money, the remaining of the migrants that also invest, maybe sometimes not by remittances, but through their investments in the place they call home, is done every month, every year. So it is. It's been absolutely fantastic. And again, I by coincidence in terms of terminology, I don't know if it's appropriate, but we just touched the tip of the iceberg. Right. To be honest, and we need to melt it. This is maybe the only time where we like actually to melt it more and to understand where we're going, because this discussion has been going on for many years, actually for over 2 decades. We've been trying to see from a development perspective, how can we support this, what I call impact investors that are doing this. I follow the impact investment world very closely on the side, and I'm always amazed about one thing, is the fact that impact investors are investors that want to, besides a return on the first place, want to have a social return into their investments. I call it to feel better at sleep at night, to sleep better at night, but it's fine. And when I talk to any single, diaspora investors, the first is they want to have a social impact back home. And okay, with the years, it has graduated to, if I can have a return on it, why not? So I can reinvest it. So we realize that it is the same type of investors that want the same thing, just with the order that is that is changed. So the simple question, are there mechanisms there in one side or the other that can be adopted, that can leverage on the same goals that impact investment world and diaspora investments have? And my answer from what I've seen is yes, absolutely yes, but there is some adaptations. And it's extremely important that we move from this dialogue to the implementation beyond pilots, to scale things, to really contradict this argument that I often hear about, yeah, diaspora investment is nice. Sometimes I hear it's cute, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't go to the scale. It requires too much investment. And this is where it becomes funny, too much pre-investment in order for it to work. Well, like anything else, I think it is required. And I think this is not a topic that that will come to pass. It's just growing. At IFAD, we're absolutely committed into this particular topic of linking migration and climate change and see the contributions of migrants. We're already working, Louise, together to really push this forward as a key priority in IFAD. So I'm really looking forward for the next set of discussions. As I mentioned, this is just the first one. And I really wanted to thank you all. We have answers live. The team has been very active trying to answer to all the questions. There's some more that we will kindly ask the panelists, if it's okay, after this panel to answer. We will post them in the GFRID and IDFR page as well. And again, this will be also the basis of our next meetings, which I will love to have you back and continues this discussion. So without further ado, thank you so much for your time. My apologies if we went just a little bit late, but I think we covered the main aspects that we wanted. So I thank you and I invite you all to join the next session at 3 o'clock Central European time for the fourth and last session of the GFRID dedicated to remittances and particularly the enabling environment. So thank you all for following us and a good continuation of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.